Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for another episode in our Kids Storytime with AHMFL. So last week we started a brand new book for us called The Absent Author by Ron Roy. It's the very first book in the A to Z mystery series, and in the book we met Dink Duncan, our main character, and his friends Josh and Ruth Rose, who are all on their way to meet their very favorite mystery author, Wallis Wallace, at the local bookstore. But things didn't work out according to plan, and Wallis Wallace never showed up. Though in a letter that Wallis Wallace had written to Dink, he said that nothing would keep him from the book signing except getting kidnapped. Dink and his friends are worried that something serious might have happened to Wallis Wallace. Today, let's see if they can figure anything out. Without further ado, The Absent Author by Ron Roy. Chapter 3. Kidnapped! Ruth Rose shrieked. Her blue eyes were huge. Josh and Dink covered their ears. Shh, said Josh. He handed the letter back to Dink and gave a quick gesture with his head. Some strange woman is watching us. Dink had noticed the woman earlier. She'd been sitting in the back of the book nook. She's coming over, Ruth Rose said. The woman had brown hair up in a neat bun, half glasses perched on her nose. She was wearing a brown dress and brown shoes and carried a book bag with a picture of a moose on the side. Around her neck, she wore a red scarf covered in tiny black letters. Excuse me, she said in a soft, trembly voice. Did you say Wallis Wallace has been kidnapped? The woman poked her glasses nervously. Dink wasn't sure what to say. He thought Wallis Wallace had been kidnapped, but he couldn't be sure. Finally, he said, Well, he might have been. My goodness, gasped the woman. Who are you? Josh asked her. Oh, pardon me, the woman blushed. My name is Mavis Green, she mumbled, and I'm a writer, and I came to meet Mr. Wallace. Dink said, I'm Dink Duncan. These are my friends Ruth Rose and Josh. Mavis shook hands shyly. Then she reached into her book bag and pulled out a folded paper. Wallis Wallace wrote to me last week. He said something very peculiar in his letter. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when he didn't show up today, and then I heard you mention kidnapping. She handed the letter to Dink. Josh and Ruth Rose read it over his shoulder. Dear Mavis, thanks for your note. I'm well, and thank you for asking, but lately my imagination is playing tricks on me. I keep thinking I'm being followed. Maybe that's what happens to mystery writers. We start seeing bad guys in the shadows. At any rate, I'm eager to meet you in Green Lawn, and I look forward to our lunch after the signing. Wallis Wallace. Wow, said Ruth Rose. First he said he's being followed, and then he winds up missing. Dink told Mavis about his letter from Wallis Wallace. He said the only thing that would keep him from coming today was if he was kidnapped. Oh dear, said Mavis. I just don't understand. Why would anyone want to kidnap Wallis Wallace? If he's the most famous mystery writer in the world, he must be rich, right? Josh said. Maybe someone kidnapped him for a ransom. Suddenly, Josh grabbed Dink and spun him around, pointing toward the street. Look! The cops are coming! They must have heard about the kidnapping! A police officer was walking toward them. Josh, that's just Officer Fallon, Jimmy Fallon's grandfather, said Dink. Jimmy came to get a book signed. I saw him inside the book nook. Maybe we should show Officer Fallon these letters, Ruth Rose suggested. They could be clues if Wallis Wallace has really been kidnapped. Who's been kidnapped? Asked Officer Fallon, who was now standing near them. Not my grandson, I hope, he said, grinning. Dink showed Officer Fallon the two letters. We think Wallis Wallace might have been kidnapped, he said. He promised he'd come to sign books, but he isn't here. Officer Fallon read Mavis's letter first, then Dink's. He scratched his chin, then handed the letters back. The letters do sound a bit suspicious, he said, but it's more likely that Mr. Wallace just missed his flight. Jimmy Fallon ran out of the book nook, waving a Wallis Wallace book at his grandfather. Grandpa, he never came! Can we go for ice cream anyway? Officer Fallon put a big hand on Jimmy's head. In a minute, son. To Dink, he said, I wouldn't worry. Mr. Wallace will turn up. Call me tomorrow if there's no news, okay?" They watched Jimmy and his grandfather walk away. Dink handed Mavis's letter back to her. He folded his and slid it into his pocket. Crazy thoughts were bouncing around in his head. What if Wallis Wallace really has been kidnapped? It happened because I invited him to Green Lawn. I'm practically an accomplice. "I don't want to wait until tomorrow," he said finally. "I say we start looking for Wallis Wallace now." "Where do we start?" Ruth Rose asked. Dink jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "Right here in the book nook." "Excuse me," Mavis Green said shyly. "May I come along too?" "Sure," Dink said. He marched back inside the book nook with the others following. Mr. Passkey was putting the Wallis Wallace books back on a shelf. He looked even more nervous than before. "Excuse me, Mr. Passkey," Dink said. "Have you heard from Wallis Wallace?" Mr. Passkey's hand shot up to his bow tie. "No, Dink, not a word." "We think he's been kidnapped," Josh said. Mr. Passkey swallowed, making his bow tie wiggle. "Now, Joshua, let's not jump to conclusions. I'm sure there's a rational explanation for his absence." Dink told Mr. Passkey about the 2 letters. "I'm really worried, Mr. Passkey. Where could he be?" Mr. Passkey took out a handkerchief and wiped his face. "I have no idea." He removed a paper from his desk and handed it to Dink. "All I have is his itinerary." The others looked over Dink's shoulder as he read, "Itinerary for Wallis Wallace. 1. Arrive at Bradley Airport at 7 p.m., Friday, July 15th, New England Airlines, Flight 3132. 2. Meet driver from Lawrence Taxi Service. 3. Drive to Shangri-La Hotel. 4. Sign books at Book Nook at 11 a.m., Saturday, July 16th. 5. Lunch, then back to airport for 4:30 p.m. flight." "Can I keep this?" Dink asked Mr. Passkey. Mr. Passkey blinked. "Well, I guess that'll be all right, but why do you need the itinerary?" Dink picked up a marker and drew circles around the words airport, taxi, hotel, and Book Nook. "This is like a trail. It leads from the airport last night to the Book Nook today," Dink said. "Somewhere along this trail, Wallis Wallace disappeared." Dink stared at the itinerary. "And we're going to find him." Chapter 4. Mr. Passkey shooed them out of the Book Nook and locked the front door. "I have to eat lunch," he said. He scurried down Main Street. "Come on," Dink said. "There's a phone in Ellie's diner." "Good, we can eat while we're calling." Josh stopped. "Who are you calling?" "The airport," Dink said, "to see if Wallis Wallace was on that 7 o'clock flight last night." They walked into Ellie's diner just as Jimmy Fallon and his grandfather came out. Jimmy was working on a triple-decker chocolate cone. Ellie stood behind the counter. As usual, her apron was smeared with ketchup, mustard, chocolate, and a lot of stuff Dink didn't recognize. Ellie smiled. "Hi, Dink. Butter crunch, right?" Dink shook his head. "No thanks, Ellie. I came to use the phone." "Excuse me, but would it be all right if I bought you each a cone?" Mavis Green asked. "I was going to buy lunch for Mr. Wallace anyway." "Gee, thanks," Josh said. "I'll have a scoop of mint chip and a scoop of pistachio." "Oh, you like green ice cream too?" Mavis said. She smiled shyly. "I'll have the same, please." "I like pink ice cream," Ruth Rose said. "I'll have a strawberry cone, please. 1 scoop." "How about you, Dink?" Mavis asked. "I'm not hungry, thanks," he said. "But you guys go ahead. I'm going to call the airport." Dink felt guilty. If he hadn't invited Wallis Wallace to Green Lawn, his favorite author would be safe at home in his castle in Maine. But Dink couldn't help feeling excited, too. He felt like a detective from one of Wallis Wallace's books. Dink stepped into the phone booth, looked up the number for New England Airlines, and called. When a voice came on, he asked if Wallis Wallace had been aboard Flight 3132 last night. "He was? Did it land at 7 o'clock?" Dink asked. "Thanks a lot." He rushed out of the phone booth. "Hey guys, they told me Wallis Wallace was on the plane, and it landed right on time." "So he didn't miss his flight," Ruth Rose said through strawberry pink lips. That's right. Dink pulled out the itinerary. He drew a line through airport. This is so exciting, Ruth Rose said. Now what? Josh asked, working on his double dipper. Dink pointed to his next circle on the itinerary. Now we need to find out if a taxi picked him up, he said. Lauren's taxi is over by the river, Ruth Rose said. Dink looked at Mavis. Would you like to come with us? We can walk there in 5 minutes. Mavis Green wiped her lips carefully with a napkin. I'd love to come, she said in her soft voice. They left Ellie's diner, walked left on Bridge Lane, then headed down Woodview Road toward the river. Mr. Passkey looked pretty upset, didn't he? Josh said, crunching the last of his cone. His chin was green. Wouldn't you be upset if you had a bunch of customers at your store waiting to meet a famous author and he didn't show up? Ruth Rose asked. Yeah, but he was sweating buckets, Josh said. I wonder if Mr. Passkey kidnapped Wallis Wallace. Josh, get real. Why would Mr. Passkey kidnap an author? Asked Ruth Rose. He sells tons of Wallis Wallace's books. I don't think Mr. Passkey's the kidnapper, Dink said. But in a way, Josh is right. Detectives should consider everyone a suspect, just the way they do in Wallis Wallace's books. At River Road, they turned left. 2 minutes later, Dink pushed open the door of the Lawrence Taxi Service office. He asked the man behind the counter if one of their drivers had met Flight 3132 at Bradley Airport the previous night. The man ran his fingers down a list on the clipboard. That would be Maureen Higgins. She's out back eating her lunch, he said, pointing over his shoulder. Walk straight through. They cut through the building to a grassy area and back. Through the trees, Dink could see the Indian River. The sun reflected off the water like bright coins. A woman was sitting at a picnic table eating a sandwich and filling in a crossword puzzle. Excuse me, are you Maureen Higgins? Dink asked. The woman shook her head without looking up. Nope, I'm Marilyn Monroe. The woman wrote in another letter. Then she looked up. She had the merriest blue eyes Dink had ever seen. Yeah, cutie pie, I'm Maureen. She pointed her sandwich at Dink. And who might you be? I'm Dink Duncan, he said. These are my friends Josh, Ruth Rose, and Mavis. We were wondering if you could help us, Ruth Rose said. Maureen stared at them. How? Did you pick up a man named Wallis Wallace at the airport last night? Dink asked. Maureen squinted one of her blue eyes. Why do you want to know? Because he's missing, said Josh. Well, I sure ain't got him. Maureen took a bite out of her sandwich. Mayonnaise oozed onto her fingers. I know, we didn't think you had him, Dink said. But did you pick him up? Maureen nodded, swallowing. Sure I picked him up. 7 o'clock sharp. I was there with my sign saying Wallace. The guy spots me, trots over, I take him out to my taxi. He climbs in carrying a small suitcase. Kinda spooky guy, dressed in a hat, long raincoat, sunglasses. Sunglasses at night. Doesn't speak a word, just sits. Spooky! Did you take him to the Shangri-La Hotel? Dink asked. Yep, those were my orders. Guy didn't have to give directions, but it would have been nice if he had said something. Pass the time, you know. Lot of people, they just chat to act friendly. Not this one. Quiet as a mouse in the back seat. Maureen wiped mayonnaise from her fingers and lips. Who is this Wallace fella anyway? He's a famous writer, Ruth Rose said. Maureen's mouth fell open. You mean I had a celebrity in my cab and never even knew it? What happened when you got to the hotel? Josh asked. Maureen stood up and tossed her napkin into the trash. I get out of my side, then I open his door. He hops out, hands me a 20. Last I seen, he's scooting into the lobby. Dink pulled out the itinerary. He crossed out taxi with a thick black line. Then he drew a question mark next to hotel. Thanks a lot, Miss Higgins, he said. Come on, guys. I have a feeling we're getting closer to finding Wallis Wallace. Maureen put her hand on Dink's arm. I just thought of something, she said. When he handed me my fare, this Wallace fella was smiling. Dink stared at Maureen. Smiling? She nodded. Yep, had a silly grin on his face, like he knew some big secret or something. So that was pretty mysterious. So why do you think Wallis Wallace was smiling when he got to the hotel? Where do you think he is now? Do you think he was kidnapped? And will Dink, Ruth Rose, and Josh be able to find him? And what is going on with Mavis Green's purse with a moose on it? Why is that detail in the book? Do you think it's going to come back later? I'm so curious! So share your predictions with what will happen in our story, The Absent Author, or any comments or favorite parts so far in the comments to receive a secret code worth 30 points for our summer reading program. And starting in July, we are going to be shifting gears a little bit. Our Kids Storytime and Tween Storytime programs are going to be moving to YouTube exclusively. So we'll have reminders posted on our Facebook pages, but you'll be able to follow the links to follow along in our stories as we read new chapters on our YouTube page, which is great because you can find all of our previous episodes there anyway. So to follow us on YouTube or just to find our episodes, you can search for Alexander Hamilton Memorial Free Library. So thank you for joining us for another episode of our Kids Storytime. We hope to see you next week as we read chapters 5 and 6 of Ron Roy's The Absent Author. Dun dun dun!